Yeah, it's great to be back. It is the polling station with William Kedjanyi and Paul Krishnamurty, and we're going to have a little bit of reflection on the local elections of last week. I wasn't around last week. What does it mean for Labour? What does it mean for Rishi Sunak? And what does it mean for the resurgent Greens and the Lib Dems as well? Donald Trump, he was in Ireland last week, gave an interview to the Sunday Independent. Remarkably, he's been in the news a little bit since. And Paul also is going to have a little bit of an update on Greece and Turkey. Turkey going to the polls this weekend, biggest test for Erdogan probably in his political career so far. But yeah, let's start with the polls from last week, and which was obviously a tough time for the Conservatives, as you would expect, William. But what can we gain in terms of knowledge of the betting markets going forward? And was there an overreaction in terms of some of the parties?
I think the main takeaway we have is that the Conservatives are headed out of government, and that Labour are headed in. We'll talk more about that later. In terms of market reaction, I thought it was a little muted, considering several interesting things about the vote. Me and Paul discussed this, we'll go more into it, but the massive numbers of Lib Dem gains in areas that the Tories have long held majorities in will be really worrying. There are a number of seats where cabinet ministers, high profile Tory MPs where they were losing councils left, right and centre. The sheer volume of Conservative losses would surely be a massive worry for CCHQ. There was a number put out, 1,000 or so, I expect it was 1,000 or so, as massive expectation management, sort of as a joke, and then they proceeded to lose over 1,000 councillors. Labour, I think, will be happy. Very happy because they are solidly on course. I know some people said they would fall short on those numbers, but it doesn't include Scotland or Wales. And the Greens, it's really important not to forget the progress the Green Party won a stack load of councillors, made gains in some really interesting areas, and in general it looks as if they are reaping the benefits of a couple of political phenomenons, maybe, in the sense of not just
The fact that there's an apocalypse on the way is probably helping as well.
Yeah, definitely, right. But also not just that, but also I think they might be picking off some Labour left voters. We didn't have a huge change in the market when it came to next general election in terms of majority. Labour 4 to 5 for a majority, 6 to 4 for a hung parliament. Labour 7 on for most seats, 7 to 2 for the Tories. So yeah, that's the long and short of it, really.
Paul is in Rhodes, back in Rhodes, so very well placed to talk about the upcoming elections in both parts of the world over there. What did you make of, Paul, talk of a potential sort of Lib Dems Labour coalition in the next government?
I think there's very little chance of that. I think that Will's right to be surprised it was muted. I would say the betting reaction was muted. I would say shocked. Everything I saw last week said thumping Labour majority.
Really?
I thought that some of the takes in the media were just off the scale crazy.
So there's a Tory collapse, which suggests that Labour is just going to make up enough ground in the areas where it wouldn't primarily. If the Tories are losing seats to the Lib Dems, Labour is just going to capitalise on that, or what was your take?
Well, right. First point is the big mistake people are making is assuming that local elections have the same rules as general elections. So whenever you have a local elections, the BBC and Sky will come up with projected national share. Okay, now that projected national share is what would have happened if all of the country had been voting in a local election, not a general election. Okay, now my estimate before that, I priced up projected national share deficit at 8.5% to Labour. It came in at 9%. Okay, that 8.5% I was basing on roughly equivalent to a kind of 17 to 20% national lead in the opinion polls, as we have seen. So it kind of indicated it. Secondly, remember that in local elections, the voters are much likelier to be older and, homeowners, well, registered in the same place for years and not pressed for time to go out and vote for an election they don't really care that much about, etc. Right? So for the Tories to lose nearly 1,100 seats in that situation is off the scale incredible. The general projections were around 600 650, it's maybe 700. I priced it up 749.5. I backed. No, I priced up 799.5. I backed 749.5. It's coming 1,061. Nobody was predicting that. Right? It was an absolute catastrophe. It was exactly the tactical pincer movement going on across the country in all types of seat that we would expect. Now, secondly, where did Labour make progress? Right? Let's look at Labour's target seats in the next election. One of their problems in recent times has been they stack up loads of votes in places they're going to win anyway, like cities and university towns, right, where lots of younger people, more diverse electorates, but they've struggled in the marginals. Well, last Thursday, they were winning in places like Amber Valley, 235th on their target list. All across Kent, places in Kent has been gone. It's been completely toxic for Labour, apart from like Canterbury, University Town, for like nearly 20 years. They won in the Brexit heartlands. They won in Stoke, in Mansfield. They won in marginals, in classic sort of bellwether marginals like Swindon and Darlington and Plymouth, right? It was a catastrophe for the Tories, and it just spoke to Labour majority. Then you have to look at the blue wall. Now, the Lib Dems aren't going to get 20% in a general election. It's just not
What
going
do
to
they get?
happen, right? Under overline at the moment, 12. Okay. Because what we see, and the Greens aren't going to get 8 or whatever they got, right? Because what we see in general elections, and it's happened particularly in the last two, despite Labour having a bit of problem attracting other parties because of the Corbyn factor, is that during the election campaign, during that final 6 weeks, Lib Dem and Green votes tend to peel off to Labour as their voters become aware that tactically it makes more sense to vote Labour to beat the Tories. Okay?
But the Tories are beaten.
It would look that way. It would look that way. But my point is that this, going back to this projected national share, it's just nonsense. It is psephological nonsense to then say that's what's going to happen in a general election, because nobody's saying that is the case.
Okay.
That's people
Can
apples as pears.
Can I bring you in there, William? Because I'm still not actually that convinced about the Labour Party in general. And I think there's probably fatigue and apathy among not only Conservative voters, but Conservative grassroots people on the ground who are like, I can't lift myself for another election here. They're probably at an all-time low in terms of general kind of popularity, whatever. But is there going to be a swing towards Lib Dems and Greens at the election because that's just where we're at? Or are Labour just going to hoover up the votes like Paul kind of implies?
I think Paul's got the right track there. The worry for the Tories, and I've been pointing to this for a while, is that they are trying to put or to keep together one of the most remarkable coalitions, if you think about it, of recent electoral history. This is voter coalitions, by the way, not parties, where they're trying to defend, I guess, the Lib Dems in more affluent areas, sometimes more towards the coast, more in the countryside, and they're trying to keep areas mainly concentrated in the Midlands and the North, but not exclusively, from the Labour Party. And when you've got all the problems they do, and you've had sort of the right-west shift they had, it's really difficult, basically, to please either of those camps or both in one go. And I think that's definitely feeding into a lot of the losses they were having in both Windsor and Maidenhead, but also Plymouth and like Medway. It's really, really deep trouble for them, namely because, as Paul said, these aren't marginal seats. It's not as if these places are constantly flip-flopping between elections. They're not really bellwethers. They're just, in general, with history, in general, they're really solidly Tory seats. They're places where cabinet ministers reside. You know, you're looking at places where, like, this is Theresa May's seats they were losing in.
So were the local elections of 2023, basically, that's where it all completely changed in terms of the face of British politics since time immemorial almost?
I think it was the moment it became clear that what we've been seeing in terms of the polls and the Tory decline over the last 18 months, I think it made it real, right? We've seen it sort of in practice. I wouldn't say, oh, this is going to be the result of the next general election, because lots of factors change, but we see the effect now of losses to Lib Dems and losses to Labour. And we also know and this will encourage Lib Dems and Labour, they can shoot for the moon, right? They know that they're on track. They know that whatever they're doing to a point is working, and I think that's really important for morale and campaigning, and also in general setting the direction of travel until the next election.
Well, what are Labour doing, Paul?
They're following the tried and trusted textbook of how you get rid of a government. The one that David Cameron employed to get rid of the Labour government, which had won 3 terms, and to a large extent the playbook that Tony Blair did. You understand that, first of all, there is absolutely zero interest amongst the swing voting public to start talking about ideology or radicalism, right? That is not England, right? You've got to talk about, basically say, we're better managers than they are, and you've got to find their weak spot, and you've got to keep slapping them. You've got to keep kicking that weak spot over.
If there are young voters, though, Paul, I just don't see why young voters, if there is a radical, if there are young voters who are obviously very worried about the climate, very worried about all the myriad of issues, I don't really see what Labour has to offer a young voter.
Well, first point is we're over a year out, and Labour would be insane to put their manifesto out. I mean, we've seen already that they've been talking about childcare for years, right? And suddenly the Tories just nick it and just steal their thunder with another thing. This is what happens, you know. And Labour used to do that to the Tories when they were in government. This is how the game works. Now, it is, I would say, it is a cast iron certainty that Labour will go into the election with some kind of Green New Deal, right? They are working with the Biden administration, right, as we speak, to introduce some kind of measures like the Inflation Reduction Act over there. Right? Well, that immediately will outflank the Tories on this, who, even if Sunak is like a person who acknowledges climate change, there's a hell of a lot of deniers in there. There's like the rabid right, the reform people are like militant about the idea of net zero, etc. So what you do is you just stick to your plan of looking like more competent managers, of not doing anything radical, of not allowing them to have to punish your weak spots. You know, I mean, let's compare this, let's say, to Corbyn or to Ed Miliband, right? Or even probably to Gordon Brown, right? We know how the media works in Britain. We know how the Tories work. They will find that weak spot and they will hammer it home to death. They will create conspiracy theories. They will do whatever they're going to do to weaken you on that. And they'll send out little micro-targeted footage of someone saying something 15 years ago to say, look, they're an extremist, right? Well, whatever Starmer is, and I'm not sitting here if someone's going to endorse anything, particularly Keir Starmer still done that much. But the best they've had in 4 years was Beergate. That's the best they could land, right? And that's what it is. Just duck and dive. Just stay out of the way of their hits. And then suddenly all of the focus goes on them and their failures. And that's what's happened.
There's a lot to be said for doing nothing, basically.
Absolutely.
Okay, William.
Don't
so Paul is talking. So, okay, I think in fairness, we've all sort of universally said Labour to win the most seats at the next election, long before it was the 1-7 that it is now, was a bet because the Tory party was imploding. Labour majority at 4-5. Paul is very strong on that. William, is that a bet?
Yes, I'm firmly in that category. I think the local elections, if anything, and should have made people more confident with that position, not less. There has been a lot of talk, and I'd like to address this, right, about national projections that show Labour falling just short of a majority. Now, it's all well and good using those numbers from last week, but there's an issue, which is that local elections aren't uniform in voting, because the way councils are structured, different parts of the country vote at different times. So last week, we had an England-only vote in certain areas, which didn't include, as I remember it, major cities outside of Liverpool, which is, you know, just so red that I think the Tories got like 1 seat or whatever out of like 60 or so. So when you project from those numbers, you are excluding Scotland and Wales. You're also excluding London, where there would be gains for Labour on current trajectories. You're excluding lots of places, basically, that national overall polls are taking into account. So when Labour is falling just short on those numbers, that actually is more of a positive than it would seem. Getting 312 or 300 or so seats based on last week's numbers is actually great for Labour, because that's before Scotland and before Wales and before the major cities. So yes, long story short, 45 out of Labour majority on these current numbers is very fair. There's a lot of water to cross the bridge, but in general, the government still has these really big problems to deal with, and it's going to be difficult, really difficult to make any big ground. House building, they've got party opposition internally. It's a really slow process. The NHS, again, difficult. It's massively difficult to do anything. And also, will they be feeling it by the time of the next election? The economy, reducing inflation or whatever, if it happens naturally, all well and good, although that's not the case at the moment. But again, how do you get people feeling like they've got money in their pocket? It's nigh on impossible. It probably won't be the case by the next election anyway. And that's like 3 of the big 5 promises before you get to the point of the stopping the boats slogan, which again is completely unworkable and is facing lots of its own opposition anyway. So long story short, they've a mountain to climb.
Okay, 4 to 5 starts for us because of William, I would argue, leads the way with political betting. Overall majority 4 to 5, no overall majority at 6 to 4, Conservative majority 13 to 2. I mean, I'll give you 33s. DM me, I'll give you 33s for max bet. Might have a few drinks later. Max bet will be about 200 quid. Labour 1 to 7, Conservative 7 to 2. Again, Lib Dems hundreds. Let's move over to the US though, Paul. And we live in a situation where now you have effectively the president, the one-time president and second favorite to be president at the next election. New York jury concludes it is more likely than not that Donald Trump sexually abused and defamed Jane Carroll, and the verdict may be a harbinger of political and legal damage to come. That's according to Annie Zirkin, the BBC. Donald Trump was actually in Ireland last week. Gave a remarkable interview to the Sunday Independent in which this was vaguely mentioned, if at all.
Well, it's not news, is it? I mean, okay, the actual cases, but this is the guy who said 7 years ago now on, widely heard footage that, you just go up to women, grab them by the pussy, etc. Right? That's Trump. That's the guy who said that Jeffrey Epstein was a great guy, a great friend, And yes, he does like his women on the other side. All I can say is he enjoys his social life. And people just laughed, right? That's what happened. The people who support Trump don't care. There's nothing he could do. He led an insurrection, right? The question is, does it help him what do the rest of the country think? And I noticed that, irrespective of the Jean Carroll case, which has got much less publicity, 55% want him charged with classified documents. 55% want him charged with Georgia election fixing, and 55% support the existing indictment in New York. And this is remarkably similar to the 54 to 56% that wanted him removed from office over the first impeachment, and the 54 to 56% that wanted it said they'd vote for anyone else but Trump in 2018. There is not going to be no movement on this. You're either in the Trump cult or you're not, right? And that's the best news for Joe Biden there is, because apparently it does seem by the day that the Republicans aren't going to take on Trump. I'm even sceptical to say it will run.
Okay, we're going over all ground here, William, but it is absolutely remarkable that the Republican Party is in this sort of a quagmire where this laughably bad option to beat. And Joe Biden isn't even necessarily that popular, and there are a lot of problems in the US. He still looks to have something of a stranglehold over what was once a reputable party.
Yes, sorry, excuse me. It's absolutely remarkable and does beg a belief, really. Imagine this happening to, hypothetical, right? But imagine this happened to an earlier Bush, or say if Mike Pence hypothetically was president or whatever, and this sort of case came out, or anything basically that happened with regards to the Access Hollywood tapes, etc., or plans for sedition, etc., came out, they'd be gone in 48 hours. That used to be how it went. even a trial or whatever would usually be enough for somebody to step down and say, I need to fight this or whatever, clear my name. But with Trump, it's just an entirely different level. And if we're analysing it, grim as it might be, with what it might have in terms of its political effects, then the direction of travel, history just tells us it won't do, because he owns the GOP and he won't be fought on it really by the majority of his party. Listen, that's a really grim thing to say.
It is. William, is there any sort of a Springer on the Democratic side? Because this election, the Democrats should win this election, let's be honest. Is there any sort of a Springer if Joe Biden is perceived at this stage to be vulnerable?
No, we're past the point. We're past that point. If it was if there was a plan or massive worry about Biden's vulnerability to the point where it was seen that he shouldn't run, already have that candidate. That there would have already been talk about it. The campaign would have been getting ready, etc. Biden will run. By the way, I don't see him as a massive vulnerability in the way others do against Trump, for a couple of reasons, right? I wouldn't have been really sold on his election prospects or re-election prospects when he started, but generally speaking, considering the hand he's been dealt, I think you can say Biden's done an excellent job. That's a personal opinion, but there have been achievements he can talk about. There is stuff he can refer to. His numbers aren't amazing. They're not terrible, but they're not amazing. You'd want them to be better. I fully appreciate that. But going up against Trump, who has worse numbers in every facet compared to Biden, it's not such a worry. The big thing is age, but I think Biden needs to remain sharp and healthy. And here's the thing. I know that everybody on the Republican side is going to try and make a big thing about it, but this was the case 4 years ago. They tried to make Sleepy Joe a thing. It stuck, but only really with Trumpites. When it comes down to it, an election is likely to have other factors in play, and the GOP, they could exploit this if it was, say, DeSantis or whatever, it'd be a much bigger worry. But Trump is 76, not in amazing health, known to have all of these character flaws, which everybody sees because he's constantly pushing them out. So I think it becomes much more of a contest of how can Biden not be beaten by Trump. And I think it's just basically not being Trump will really work for at least a large part of the population, also including independents as well.
Okay, so we're going to conclude on Greece and Turkey, but Paul, you kind of take the piss out of yourself a bit and say people say I'm into my conspiracy theories and that, but you have a situation where since I was last on, we've had another quite well publicized mass shooting, because a lot of them aren't even necessarily publicized. You have a situation where the both parties would probably agree that you can't really go against the NRA for fear of the 3 million armed Americans who are in the NRA who might actually take umbrage at that. We're in it. So if the Conservatives flop at the next election or are beaten again, I just don't know where this country is actually going.
Well, hang on. The Democrats do go against the NRA very strongly.
They do, but what can they do?
You need 60 senators to pass a bill, which is going to need 9 Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't time or place, but I could go into the 30-year-plus story of how this happened and the Reform Party and the rat fucking of American politics, partly by Russia and partly by the far right and all sorts of other things that has created this thing. I think that they're in big trouble, but I think the same thing applies everywhere. I mean, when we're talking about the old days when scandals used to hurt politicians, right? This is before the age of social media and micro-targeting. This is what's happened. I think that 2016 was this massive wake-up call to everybody because we never really thought about it before. And then Trump and Brexit happened and suddenly extremism seemed to flourish everywhere. And I mean, no one's really addressing it. No one's really even acknowledging it. And I don't want to be the harbinger of doom, but I think next year is just going to be horrific because these mass shootings are happening more and more. Many of them, some of them are just crazy people, but many of them are political. Many of them are racially motivated. They're targeting particular segments of the community. Right now, that's going to go on all year. Trump, I am in no doubt, will spend the entire year ramping up his fascist base. You know, many of whom have just been convicted, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers. And I don't know where we go. I mean, I think we should just be thankful here and in Europe that we don't have those gun laws, because the same thing would be possible here. I do think that the right wing, again, this cuts back to the British election, and what's so difficult for Sunak is that Sunak sort of seems to be at least inching towards a more pragmatic sort of conservatism, right? But you can't do it because so much of their base have been radicalised, and I don't think that's going to change. I think that's the nature of the conversation now.
Yeah, I think the UK has, a lot of issues, but, subsequent to Dunblane and what the UK did in terms of gun control is absolutely laudable. Just getting on to Greece and Turkey, the Turkish election, fascinating stuff this weekend. The AK party, obviously, this is a big challenge for Erdogan. You're just over the border in Rhodes, Paul. What's the feeling on the ground in terms of how this is going to go? It's been a horrific few months for Turkey with the earthquake and all that, but so many issues there as well. How do you call it?
Well, I noticed that polar polls have Erdogan trading by something like 1.2%. Okay. I am inclined to say that means Erdogan. I haven't had a bet. I would not back odds on Erdogan losing. He has been known to rig elections before, or to certainly interfere with them. Plus, the other candidate is the Istanbul candidate. And Erdogan's whole shtick for his whole time is he's the true Turkey. He represents the real Turkey. We will see. But as I say, it's not something I'm confident in, because I think there's plenty of pragmatic reasons, such as the earthquake and the exposure of just how poor housing is, how poor conditions are, and such as the terrible economy, that you would think an incumbent would lose. But we're talking about a dictator here. A dictator has already proved that he'll move heaven and earth to rig something. So I'm inclined to think that will be the case. And then next week, of course, we've got Greece.
Last word to you, William.
Yeah, the point Paul makes about Erdogan and interfering in elections is very important. If you are betting in these contests, do check your T&Cs. Check them to the last letter. Because I assure you,
we pay out on rigged elections.
I mean, again, it's staggering. It's a thing, but yeah, political bettors, especially worldwide, they really need to consider the integrity of the contest they're betting on. If so, what your bookmaker, etc., will do if it looks like there's been an obvious fobbing off. It's more of a risk now than ever. There are more elections that are bet on freely now over here that may not be by the by. But with regards to Turkey, it's a massive turning point for the country. Either way, if it happens, I would take into account that Erdogan is throwing huge concessions at the population, massive promises, and in a tight race, it's possible that influences things. I wouldn't have a strong view on it, to be honest, but yeah, it will be really fascinating to see, and hopefully it goes without too much incident.
Okay, thanks to the lads. Next week, it's the Northern Ireland local elections on the 18th, which is tomorrow week, Thursday. And as much as Northern Ireland is not everyone's cup of tea politically, it's actually a fascinating election, because the intransigence of the DUP, the fact that Sinn Féin have effectively just gone over to the coronation and are now probably pallier with the Royals than any other party, and also the fact that Sinn Féin in the south recently has been polling ahead of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael put together. This is seismic stuff. How will this translate in the polls? Where are the SDLP at? Where's the rest of unionism at? So I'll have a word with William. We'll do something on it next week, maybe beforehand, maybe in response to it, but something will be in the pipeline. And yeah, we shall be back next week. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. That was the polling station on Star Sports.